Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon. Welcome to the 7th episode of EPHA's Access to Medicines Dialogues. Access to Medicines Dialogues is a series of online events. We started them at the European Public Health Alliance last October. We touch upon the hottest, I would say, topics on access to medicines. And today we will zoom in on the topic of antimicrobial resistance and what can the EU, what should the EU do to develop effective antibiotics? How do we guarantee sustainable access to effective antibiotics? And I couldn't be joined by a better crowd of experts representing key players in the field of AMR, focusing for the purpose of this webinar on the question of human medicines only. We're not going to look at animal health. We're not going to look at the food systems. You all know that AMR is a vast topic area. It's a very complex and multi-layered challenge. For the purpose of this webinar today, we will focus, as I said, on the question of antibiotics for humans, for human health. Join me today, I have Helle Agard. Helle Agard, she's the Deputy Director of REACT, Action on the Antimicrobial Resistance for Europe. Rohit Malpani, an independent public health consultant, a lawyer by training, and a man with a long experience and expertise in access to medicines with various positions in the past, including Médecins Sans Frontières. And of course, Tim Jinks from the Wellcome Trust. He's the head of the Drug Resistant Infections Program of the Wellcome Trust. As with all of our, welcome everyone, as with all of our sessions, the session is recorded. I do encourage you to engage on Twitter using the hashtag Access to Medicines Dialogues. And of course, you can watch all of the previous episodes of Access to Medicines Dialogues, including this one as of tomorrow, on the EPHA YouTube channel. So thank you so much for your time and thank you for joining us. I think it is a very timely discussion. I know that all of us, all we worry about and all we hear about these days and months over the past year is COVID-19. But at EPHA, we've always zoomed in on the question of AMR from different aspects. And I think the European Commission would be happy with this event today because it seems that, yes, everything is about COVID-19. And of course, there are implications also in the field of AMR when it comes to COVID-19 and the impact of the pandemic. But for the European Commission, it seems that for the work program, AMR is prioritized. We see AMR and the question of antibiotics development highlighted in the discussion around HERA, this new agency. We will see what happens with it. Right now, there are ongoing discussions as to what HERA should look like and what it should prioritize and what it should forget about. AMR is definitely one of the topics that will remain on the radar, but also on the European Commission pharmaceutical strategy, we see AMR being prioritized there as well. But before we go into the, let's say, the more relevant questions that are with us today and on the policy agenda for the months to come, I would like to go to Rohit Malpani. Rohit, how did we get there? And what is this problem that we're talking about? I mentioned that it's pretty vast and complex, but if you could give us a brief overview, let's say, of how we got here and what is the problem right now with antibiotics. Thank you.
Thanks, Giannis, for having me here and for inviting me to join, and hello to everyone. So I'll just say a couple of remarks quickly, and I'm sure Helle and Tim can add to this. The first just being that antibiotic resistance is natural. It's an evolutionary phenomenon which has existed as long as we've had antibiotics and had systems of medicine. It is something that we can slow down by having appropriate access, by ensuring access to the right antibiotic for a patient in need. But because it's a natural phenomenon, we have to continue to replenish the antibiotic pipeline to ensure that we are keeping up with the natural rate of resistance that can be faster or slower, again, depending on human behavior. But the problem is that we've had a long-term decline in the productivity of developing new antibiotics due to a confluence of factors that are all human-made. There are scientific issues, but there are many human-made mistakes that we have made. And I would call it a perfect storm, except we've had this confluence of factors really for decades now. And I think it's worth pointing out a few of them. The first is that we've had an underinvestment by governments now for decades, even as we've known over and over again that we have a need to make much deeper investments at the early stages of drug development as well as the late stages. And that lack of investment has an impact both in terms of developing the necessary early stage compounds, which then can be developed. We know that the public sector plays a critical role in most of the development of new and effective products that ultimately come to market. It's also led to an underinvestment in terms of individuals who go into research or remain in research for developing new antibiotics. We've also had the problem of an underinvestment by companies. And this underinvestment by companies is very much caused by companies, because what we have seen now for over 3 decades is a decision to push only one model of drug development that's based upon intellectual property. And that's based on the idea that the only drugs that are worth making are the ones that can earn significant revenues. So because we've had essentially one system of incentivizing the development of new drugs and vaccines, which is essentially based on intellectual property, it has not created the incentives that lead to companies to make their own investments into developing new antibiotics. And so what we've seen over the last 3 decades is we've moved from having about 18 companies involved in the development of new antibiotics to today of only about 6 major companies.
So you're saying effectively, you're saying that pharma has dropped the ball in recent years, well, in recent decades, practically.
Well, yes. I mean, what we have is first, perhaps an unintentional decision to focus only on one model of drug development and one system of incentives, which has then been followed up by this sort of decision to only remain focused on this system of drug development, only system of incentives, alongside this withdrawal of the pharmaceutical industry from developing new drugs. And so we've now reached a situation today in which we both have underinvestment, both by the public and private sector, which, as I'm sure we'll talk about, is starting to turn around, and we're starting to see changes, but we have to learn from the past and also figure out what we must do in the present and future.
Thank you, Rohit. Helle, React, well, it's one of the long-standing protagonists in this field, and you're trying to draw attention to this issue. And this event is timely also thanks to your work, because you presented the new, pretty comprehensive study, and Helle will share the link to the report, where you effectively draw attention to what Rohit just mentioned, which is what is the role of the public in all of this, and what should governments do from now on? Because I think we agree that over the past 5-6 years, there's been so much talk, there's been so many headlines, even in mainstream media, about so many reviews, high-profile political declarations, etc. Why did you come out with this report now? And if you could give us a snapshot, and of course we'll come back to this, of your findings. But why now, and why this report? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Dennis, and thanks also from my side for inviting us on. Why now? Well, a little bit of 2 things. Well, first, React has really been involved in this field since the very beginning of its establishment, which is back in 2005, and have actually pushed a lot for this issue over the years, and have been part of sort of quite critical work. We've worked with EMA, BMA, the ECDC to sort of produce the first pipeline analysis that was put out there, to really get a view of how critical was the situation. And this goes many years back. And we've also worked very closely with the Swedish presidency during the Swedish presidency of the Council back in 2009, where sort of we had the first global conference that really looked at the problem of antibiotic R&D and the crisis that we were already facing back then. And so this year, React is turning 15, and we kind of thought, this is a core issue that we've been working on for so long, and it really makes sense to sort of write up a bigger report that both looks at, what have we done so far, how has it worked, what do we need to do going forward, and also trying to collect, all the thinking and the discussions that we have engaged in over the years into one document. And I would dare to say that it's probably one of the first, and it is one of the first of its kind from sort of civil society to come out and really put the positions out there and write up the more policy-based positions on this. Yeah. So that's kind of the background for it. Then I think more on terms of the timing of it, obviously what we're looking at now is a world that's trying to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. And we're seeing a lot of things happening in that space that are both encouraging, but also to a large extent, very, very depressing, I would say. Of course, encouraging to see that you can actually manage to develop new drugs, vaccines, well, mostly vaccines, I'd say, once you have the capital, you have the political will, you have the focus, then it can actually go much faster than any of us expected that it could go. The depressing part of it is that, we've just not managed to find a way of doing this in a way that serves the whole population on this globe. And we are coming up against these incredible barriers to access, and basically a principle where those that have the most are the ones that gets first, and then the rest sort of relies on either charity or waiting a couple of years, and which is, from a public health perspective, just mind-boggling that we haven't actually progressed more when it comes to dealing with global access to essential drugs and vaccines and diagnostics.
And Helen,
yeah,
in a nutshell, the main message coming out of the report that you published a few days ago, what would it be? And of course, then we'll go into the details of it. What is your message? What is it for someone who hasn't read it? How would you summarize it in 2 sentences, let's say?
Well, I think the report is one that tries to shift the global debate from one that has primarily focused on whether or not we should focus our energy on putting in place push or pull incentives, which is very much a narrative that's about what incentive suits pharmaceutical companies and how do we re-engage them. And this report is trying to make the argument that that isn't the end goal. The end goal is for us to ensure sustainable access to effective antibiotics for everyone. And given that we have such a breakdown in the systems, and everyone, which is quite unique for this space, everyone agrees that there is a total breakdown of systems. This is really a chance to rebuild for something better, something dramatically different, and build a system of R&D that really serves, all of us, rich and poor.
Thank you, Helle. Tim, speaking of key players in this field, I would say that it is thanks to your work, it is thanks to the work of the Wellcome Trust over the years to really emphasize and remind policymakers and world leaders of the issue and the gravity and the challenges related to AMR. What is your perspective right now in terms of where are we today? Rohit mentioned and Helle mentioned a whole array of issues, but your let's say in an overview of where are we today, what would you say from the Wellcome Trust perspective? And thank you for being with us today, of course.
Yanis, thank you very much for including me in this panel. This is a very important topic, and it's one that remains important even in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, and one that we need to feed into our thinking as the world looks to build back better as we wish to emerge from today's pandemic. Antimicrobial resistance has introduced a problem that is a global crisis. So the perspective here is one that we need to remember. It's a global problem. And like what we've learned with COVID-19, with infectious diseases, no one is safe in the world unless everyone is safe. And this is a very important context here. So while every region can look to address their local issues and solve problems for themselves, it has to be done in a way that is coordinated and collaborative with everyone else in the world. Wellcome Trust as an organization has been directly engaged with this issue now for decades. Our first strategic efforts around it were back in 1999. And we found that in 2016, there wasn't sufficient progress. And very concerned that actually the trajectory on this issue is that the global health threat is increasing and getting worse, despite the realization and understanding by experts that this is a very real problem. So what we have is a silent pandemic, one that is slow moving. And so the crisis is slowly unfolding in front of us, very different than what has happened with COVID-19. And this is very problematic. While we've increased the understanding around the world that AMR is a problem, it's a threat to public health, it isn't the burning platform that is attracting that much attention, even separate from COVID-19. So that's very, very concerning. Is there a clear enough understanding that this is a problem that must be addressed? But within this, Wellcome has identified a couple of priority areas, and very principally, we think that reinvigorating the pipeline of new therapeutics is something that must be done now. There is a crisis in the therapeutics pipeline. And today, there was the release by WHO of the pipeline analysis showing that while there has been a little bit of improvement in the state of the pipeline of candidate antibiotics, it's woefully inadequate for the world's needs. And this is something that is deeply concerning and something we'd like to see addressed. It remains important, we believe, that not only should there be more investment in this space, but the private sector has a key role to play. Intellectual property rights is a feature of serving as an incentive for private sector engagement, and not just the pharmaceutical companies, but also private sector capital or private capital in addition to public capital. But very importantly, intellectual property rights mustn't be a barrier to access, particularly for those in low and middle income countries. So there is a very important debate to be had in terms of the role of mechanisms for incentives to make sure that everyone has the appropriate access and that access is equitable throughout the world.
Thank you, Tim. So if I hear you correctly, if I understand you, all of you correctly, you agree that there is indeed a market failure. There is a question: how do we make the antibiotics market viable? But Rohit, is it a question of the lack of public funding? Is it a question of absence or lack of venture capital? Because clearly there is a misalignment between incentives and global needs. But what is it exactly when it comes to the question of money at the end of the day?
Well, first, just start with part of it is because there's sort of this unjustified belief that intellectual property can essentially solve the problem. So the issue with intellectual property isn't just about access, and in fact, that may not play out as seriously, let's say, for antibiotics, perhaps compared to cancer medicines or hepatitis C medicines. It's this belief that somehow having an intellectual property system will ensure that you'll get the right investment, and then because there's such a focus on only using intellectual property as an incentive, we don't end up then looking at alternative systems that actually move outside of the intellectual property system to find the right approaches. So we're trapped. Now, the reason that can end up influencing both venture funding and public funding is often public funders will try to align themselves increasingly over the last 20 years with what ultimately has commercial value. So instead of focusing upon public investments that actually are just needed, antibiotics are a cornerstone of modern medicine, they end up often being influenced by what companies think will be more profitable for them in the long term. And of course, the same goes for venture funding, because ultimately, you're going to look for that exit strategy and that return. So the first challenge we have is really, can we simply identify a way of developing new antibiotics that do not always have to be responsive to the commercial market and do not always have to be responsive to what actually works within an intellectual property system? And as long as we're just sort of trapped in this one way of doing things and trapped in only saying that we can work with these actors and in these approaches, we're not really going to find a way to do this sustainably over the next 2, 3, 4 decades, and really for forever.
This to make it clear and understandable to our viewers, and I see hands being raised. I do encourage our viewers, our participants, please do ask your questions in the Q&A chat room, and I'll make sure to bring them in the conversation during this conversation. So what you're saying, Rohit, is that if we only stick to the current business model, the big pharma business model, the big pharma business model itself is driving resistance because it is so much focused, as we see also in medicines, on the sales and on making profit, right? Is that where the misalignment comes, in your opinion?
Well, I mean, in a way, that would be almost nice to have. I mean, there certainly are problems with in terms of industry marketing and how that can end up fueling resistance. And I believe in REACT's report, they talk about the fact that in many countries today, companies are not, abiding by basic standards that would separate out the marketing from the advertising activities from the marketing of drugs. But the real first order issue is just companies are not willing to engage in the development of models that simply move outside of what has been traditionally used for developing drugs that otherwise have a very large market. What's been interesting, of course, with COVID-19 is there's really been no choice. Governments have had to pump in, over 100 billion euros to basically develop new medicines and vaccines. And companies are, both benefiting from that and then ultimately keeping control of these products. But we've basically moved into a different model for COVID-19 because we have no choice. I think as Tim is noting, we're on a burning platform, but people are not yet sort of engaging in the more dramatic actions to change from business as usual to something different.
But Helle, I hear you, but what is the alternative? And how realistic is this alternative? And again, I think governments are, as we see now with COVID-19, they're throwing a lot of money, right? The question is whether they're attaching any conditionalities, any conditions to this funding, or whether they're using this funding as leverage in order to steer the innovation process. But really, what is the alternative, if any?
Well, I mean, I think that's the the key issue here, because at the end of the day, there is no alternative than the alternative, because the current model isn't working. As we've seen the last 30 years, we're not getting the new drugs that we need, right? So the intellectual property model and the way that it's working, it's not controversial for anyone longer to say it's not working for antibiotics. It's not delivering the drugs we need. So yes, it's not appropriate for ensuring access and these kind of things that we discussed in the broader debate on access to medicines, but also crucially for antibiotics, it isn't effective. It's not going to develop. So, it's just a question of time, I guess, before we can get sort of politicians and policymakers to also kind of get used to that idea and sort of accept it, right? I think a lot of the answers lie in finding a way to getting the public sector to sort of steer with more intent, to set their goals on what is it that they want to achieve. Is it re-engaging companies, or is it developing new drugs that we really need? I mean, at the end of the day, that's kind of the decision governments will have to make. And if they choose the latter, then they have to get involved in a whole different way, right? And that's obviously that's what the whole report is pushing for. We want to see the governments engage much more clearly, with much more intent, put conditions on funding, and they could take a clue from their Wellcome Trust here. They are already engaging in that kind of work of attaching conditions to funding. They are even including the right to have so-called margin rights, where they can appropriate the intellectual property if companies are not following the conditions that they're putting in place, right? So it's interesting to see that a private foundation like Wellcome Trust, pushes this and doing it, but we see governments being really hesitant about doing this, not wanting to engage in it, right? Why is that? That is the question that I think policymakers need to ask themselves. Why are they the most foot-dragging actors in this space?
Tim, I'll come to you because they keep referring to the Wellcome Trust, as you can see. But before that, I would like to ask Helle, you in your report, REACT is calling for an end-to-end approach. Could you please elaborate? What do you mean by that?
Sure. So it's coming back to the point I've made about moving beyond a conversation that is only about push and pull incentives. Now, that's a little bit what we're talking about today, sort of like the economic model, right? The point that we're making in the report is that there are multiple challenges throughout the development of an antibiotic and the deployment and distribution of an antibiotic that needs to be addressed. And the question itself, is broader than just development of antibiotics. It's about managing antibiotic resistance, right? So in that sense, that requires us to have interventions at the very early stage and setting, priorities correctly, making sure that our R&D funding goes into the most needed and the pathogens of biggest global concern, right? We need to make sure that we have an ecosystem built up that actually can sort of develop truly new drugs, not just these modifications of existing drug classes that we're seeing, that Tim referred to today, that the WHO comes out and say, that's mostly what we have in the pipeline now. We need governments to go in and put in place new types of incentives that de-link the R&D costs from the price and the sales volume of the end product. And then we need to think about, how do we produce, how do we procure, how do we register, how do we ensure quality, and how do we get these drugs introduced into countries in a way where we don't propagate sort of the current practices we're all engaging in a sense, or all countries are engaging in, which is overuse and misuse, and in low middle-income countries, extreme lack of access to these essential drugs. So the challenge is much, much bigger. And the thing is, what we do in the R&D, let's say the R&D part of the equation, the business model part, has huge impact on how we're solving these challenges downstream. So that's why we're arguing for this end-to-end approach. You need to see the whole picture. You need to set that goal of what you want to achieve, and then you design your your interventions so that you deliver towards that goal. That's the point of it.
Thank you, Helle. I think that's a very clear illustration also for our audience to understand exactly what we mean by the end-to-end approach. Tim, over to you. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but in recent years or in the recent past, one of the flagship initiatives, or a very important development in the field, was the establishment last summer, if I'm not mistaken, of the AMR Action Fund. And I think there we see a different approach from what we've heard so far from Rohit and Helle. And the Wellcome Trust is involved in the AMR Action Fund. If you could please explain to us, what is your involvement and why do you support this initiative?
Indeed. So the AMR Action Fund is a company that has been established as an investment vehicle to support late-stage antibiotic product development. The Action Fund will identify and invest in small companies who are the innovators in this space to provide them the financial support as well as technical support to bring forward the most promising candidates that can address the greatest public health needs. This initiative was led by industry. It came from the IFPMA as a coalition of the pharmaceutical industry who were the primary investors in this space. Wellcome is an investor alongside the European Investment Bank to provide a broader perspective into this space. Why is it important? Well, the fact is that there is insufficient funding available to bring through promising candidates. Wellcome is also a co-funder of the CARB-X initiative, which focuses on the early stage candidate identification and phase 1 studies. But really, there's no pathway for supporting these promising candidates to go forward and hopefully be registered and approved to be used with patients. The AMR Action Fund itself, though, is a bit of a sticking plaster or a Band-Aid to address the problem. The fact is we have this broken market. There is insufficient investment in the space, both from the private sector as well as what's available from the public side. And we need something desperately so that innovation has a path forward. So that's the role the AMR Action Fund will play over a period of time, 7 to 12 years, to identify some most promising candidates and foster those to come through. It is not going to be the long-term solution, however. What it does is it buys us all time. It hopefully helps contribute positively to reinvigorating that pipeline. But most importantly, it's just buying us time while we figure out what are the right incentives, the appropriate incentives to sustainably support the path, the pipeline for antibiotics. You know, this is something that we've said a number of times. It's about incentives. While I could not agree more with Helle, we mustn't forget that the real reason to do this, what good looks like, is that people are treated for infectious diseases and that there is never a threat from drug-resistant infection. That's what good really looks like. That's the reason that we do it. But what we recognize is, well, to be able to do that, you have to have antibiotics. They have to be available, accessible, and affordable. We also need to make sure that there is a pipeline of bringing those through. And so therein, that's where we end up talking about these incentives and pull incentives and push incentives. So one of the key barriers is around this space of how do you bring through the promising candidates into the marketplace. And to be fair to the private sector, the pharmaceutical industry, they have been calling for there to be innovation for the incentive space. The pharmaceutical industry is not clinging solely to this idea that intellectual property rights is the only way forward, that's the only business model. That there are, in fact, strong calls for incentives to be developed by governments so that there are appropriate rewards for drugs that suit public health needs. So there is a need for serious action in this space. And a good example, which I do want to highlight, is an effort underway in the UK today. They're running a pilot program that provides a way of funding new antibiotics to be available, not on the basis of volumes of sales, but simply that they're available to be used in the National Health Service. So it's described as a Netflix type model. It's a subscription payment. And the beauty of this as an incentive is it creates a clear understanding for the pharmaceutical companies providing the product of what the reliable income that can be achieved around that. And on the flip side is the reliability of the supply of a drug product into a healthcare system. So this is a really nice example of how an incentive can be deployed by governments. We need to see more of that across the world.
Thank you very much, Tim. This is a very good overview, and thank you for bringing the Netflix model up as well. We will talk about it and the possible limitations or applicability of that beyond the UK. But Rohit, so the AMR Action Fund, it seems that the industry is rising to the occasion. No, they're putting money down where governments are not practically. Is that so?
Well, yeah, and to respond to that, and also, what Tim was saying, which I think was a very helpful overview. Industry is calling for new incentives, I think, as Tim's noting, but it's actually just doubling down, right? So we've had pharmaceutical companies, I believe, in the European Union asking for things such as transferable exclusivity vouchers, which are really just extensions of intellectual property, and actually trying to sort of latch on to the blockbuster profits that are made elsewhere. And they've also brought up things such as market entry rewards, which are essentially to mimic the blockbuster rewards that they earn in other areas. And that's part of the problem, because what we're seeing is for a lot of companies, the opportunity costs are too high to invest in antibiotics. There's too much money to be made from cancer or from other areas to justify antibiotic investments. So the solution is, well, if we can recreate that market, then maybe we can invest in it. And so in a sense, when I look at the AMR Action Fund, yes, it's an investment, and yes, it is something that can help to unlock some of the late stage development, as Tim is noting. But if I'm cynical about it, it's almost saying, this isn't really worth our time. So we're just going to write a check so that we don't have to actually put real investment into these areas. This is just going to be a limited amount of money that a large number of companies can put together to sort of translate a couple of products and, as Tim is noting, putting sticking plaster. There is concern also with this.
How much money are we talking
I believe
about?
it's $1 billion. I might have that wrong, over a decade, which is not something to say that's bad. Pfizer's going to earn $15 billion this year from its COVID vaccines. So, the problem is, though, the governance of the AMR Action Fund is only going to be run outside of governments. And that also then leads to questions about priority setting. Now, I think it's right to say that this is where governments have to step in and where governments have to put the investments. And this is maybe the hope I know we'll talk about, for instance, with HERA or for other investment vehicles that might be created in the United States or the European Union, or perhaps more collectively. But the question is, will they invest in new approaches, or are we just going to chase our tails? Are we just going to say, here's a lot of money to company X and Y because we really want you to try to just, reallocate some of your resources away from cancer to this area? Or are we going to say, this is not commercially interesting to those companies and we have to find other approaches?
Helle, you want to jump in? I have a few questions, but go ahead.
No, I just wanted to make the point that React has previously been involved in a European or EU funded initiative called Drive AB, where it was a consortium of a lot of different actors that were in there, public, private, including companies. And when it was all started off, React was a real proponent of it and really wanted to engage in it and was happy to be involved in it. And companies at that time, this was before I joined React, so this is what I've been told. I joined at a later stage and was part of this project then. But when it started, there was a real interest from companies. There was a sort of an interest to sort of explore, what does a new model look like? How can we do this, right? Halfway through that project, then, the UK review came out and this important, or this big report made the call on governments that they should put in place these market entry awards that all of a sudden put this sort of number that was like between 1 and 4 billion on the table for one antibiotic. That changed the whole game in that project that we were in part in. All of a sudden, it wasn't about finding a new really good way. This was all about now seeing that, okay, all of a sudden we can actually, we should sort of run with this call. We should ask governments to make these markets just as profitable as they are everywhere else. And then, all these sort of good collaborative sort of, thing we had going in terms of finding a different pathway forward, kind of ended up in this doubling down of like, yes, we can do delinkage, but companies keep the IP, so they both get the market entry award and they also get to retain sales. And we kind of like, it just watered out, right?
But
so
can you explain a bit what is the market entry award, so that people understand?
So a market entry award is a big reward that you provide companies at the stage of market entry. In order to replace, in theory, the sales revenue you get from selling the drug on the market, right? But what that sort of then turned into, this was the idea that, okay, by extension, if you're doing that, then that would mean you would hand over the intellectual property, right? So you would actually pay, because you paid for the R&D then you don't need to then you have a de-linked mechanism. You don't need to rely on sales, and you don't really need to rely on high prices, because companies have already been reimbursed for their investments plus more. But that was never going to sort of fly there. That was always going to be like, no, it's this, and it's also keeping the intellectual property. And then, down to, with the years, we're also keeping some of the sales. So, yes, I do see that there has been a will somewhere, but I'm not, when it actually comes down to it, I'm not seeing companies actually willing to engage in real conversation about a new model. It just tends to end up in sort of slight modification of the existing one.
Tim, you want to come in?
Yes. And first of all, I think that we need to have some clarification about delinkage, because there's actually two types of delinkage, and the differences are very, very important. So the first delinkage, which is, I would argue, most important, is separating the volume of sales from price. Because of the nature of antimicrobials and how that the usage drives the emergence of resistance, one of the things that we must see is delinkage of volume from cells, so that there is not a perverse incentive that drives antimicrobial usage. Now, that is something that has already begun to happen in many markets in the world, but not all markets in the world. But critically important that there is a delinkage of the volume and sales figure here, so that we do not have financial incentives that drives antimicrobial usage upward, and therefore increasing the rates of antimicrobial resistance in itself. The second form of delinkage, it relates to what Hela's primarily talking about, this idea of how the full lifetime rewards obtained from sales of a product can pay for the investment for generating that product in the first place. And so that's where things like market entry rewards themselves can come in. but we need to make sure that we are very clear, and also as governments are looking at this, that they're very clear about the two pieces, because the first one I talk about is about good stewardship. We need to make sure that all of the processes involved with use of antibiotics and other antimicrobials reinforces good stewardship. While nature is against us in terms of the emergence of resistance, we can change many things so that the impact of it is significantly reduced. We do not have to live in this hamster wheel of, oh my goodness, introduce a new drug, have it go flame out very quickly due to resistance. We must find a new one in 3 years. So what can we do? We have to increase stewardship. One of those ways relates to the delinkage, so that there are no perverse incentives across the system driving up antimicrobial uses. Now, this other piece, in terms of how what's the right risk reward potential in the commercial space here, if we put it much more broadly. And it does need to be considered, what is the appropriate value that societies place on that? And governments have to look at this. And it's very interesting because as we think about the issues here in terms of the actual payers in Europe, well, really, the payers are governments. The most antibiotic sales by far are governments themselves. So the payment mechanisms, the procurement and the reimbursement mechanisms are a key element to this. And there should be innovation around those, so that an appropriate value is paid, is one that is acceptably rewarding the risk that's taken on, and not making sure that, to make sure that's not oversized. Certainly we don't want it to be some sort of casino approach that successful antibiotics mean that it's time for huge profit taking. But the fact is, there should be an appropriate balance in risk and reward in this space. Wellcome has done some work internally to look at what are the mechanisms for incentives, and what are the roles that can be played in changing the ecosystem overall. And we did look at one approach, which is a direct fund model, where the public sector takes on the full direct costs overall. And we came to the conclusion that that would be a bill that actually governments would be unwilling to pay. It is also one that is not as cost effective as a mixed model, where there are incentives that bring in private capital into this space. So we do think it's really important that there are ways to design incentives that bring in other investment. It should not rely solely on state payment throughout. And of course, wherever there is government investment, there should be the appropriate ownership of that, and that should design in the delivery back into society that is appropriate and proportionate to that investment provided from public funding.
And in recent years, also, the Wellcome Trust has done progress in this, because you, on your own initiative, you've put out access conditions, and you've outlined your vision of having some access conditionalities attached to your funding, from what I recall, and that was only a couple of years back, if I'm not mistaken, Tim.
Well, what we've done in this space is, first of all, a couple of years ago, we announced that we had principles as relates to access.
Correct.
But very recently, and directly related to CARB-X itself, is that we brought forward a set of guidelines to support how access can be brought in line during the R&D phase. So something that we think has been sorely missing is that access is treated as an afterthought. Yeah. You wait until you have a product in the marketplace, and then, okay, what happens with access? Well, that is something that is hugely disadvantageous to most of the world. That means that there are tremendous delays. So what we're trying to do, this is not the full solution, is simply one step in the right direction, is that during R&D, that those developers should start designing in the approaches that can achieve access. So there should be an access plan. And when we talk about antibiotics, they should also include in that ways to achieve correct stewardship. And our expectation, our conditions around that is if there is a market upon licensing, that they would then move forward to fulfill that plan. And Helle did mention, should that not happen, then we have a right to negotiate so that we can see to make it happen in other ways.
Thank you. I know we only have 15 minutes left, and I do want to talk about the role of the European Union and what Europe can do and should do. So, Rohit, I'll keep that in mind in your response. Yes, please, go ahead.
So first, I just want to say, risk here, of course, a lot of the risk is taken by the public sector, especially for the early stage research and developments. And in the REACT report, it talks about that. That's where most of the risk is. That's where it's the riskiest. And that's where you see the most public investment. The public sector takes on a lot of risk also. It's not just the private sector. And we have to pay. It's just a question of what type of payment you have. You can have a mixed model during the research and development phase, but you end up paying more often for antibiotics at a high price than you would by paying for it upfront. It's just a question of where you put it. If you rely on a model that's much more driven by the private sector, you may exclude developing certain formulations, for instance, for children, which I know is an important priority for the Wellcome Trust, and then you end up having to pay for that afterwards. You may skip out on formulations or on secondary indications which are relevant for low and middle income countries. And you may also not end up having companies actually engage, for instance, in phase 4 trials, or even just focusing on any LMIC priority. So we have to pay for all of these things. It's just a question of the incentive system you set up to do this. I also want to make sure we're distinguishing between large and small companies. Too much of the debate talks about the largest companies, but most of the innovation is coming from the smaller companies. And I think there you have more potential for mixed models, especially where you can, for instance, have milestone prizes that can then pay smaller companies for the risks they take, and then blending that with public funding instead of just simply thinking about what we have at the end stage, which really only works for the largest companies.
Thank you, Rohit, and thank you for reminding us of that very important detail, that it's a very, very diverse landscape. And Helle, exactly on that, I mean, in Europe, we have fantastic research, right? I guess also from my experience, it's a very fragmented landscape. But looking also at what players should be prioritized, where should investment go, and based on what Rohit was saying, what kind of role do you see for Europe? And are you encouraged by the discussions around HERA, for instance?
Well, I mean, we don't know that much about HERA yet. There's a little bit out, but yeah, I mean, we're encouraged by the fact that they're choosing to have one of their pilot projects focusing on AMR, and we certainly think that there is a promise there and possibility for the European Commission to test out new approaches. This is exactly what a preparatory action is there for, to test things that you're not able to test sort of within the normal legal boundaries of the European Union, right? And we're also encouraged by the fact that they want to take an end-to-end approach, which I think is very much in line with what we think is needed for this area. And what we need in terms of, drawing on what's sort of the strength in Europe. Yes, there is strong research. We also have a lot of small and medium enterprises that are engaged in this space. And I think, it would be really useful to start thinking about how, targeting incentives to the players that are actually still in the field, that have a different business model that we might be able to work with, than constantly having this, falling back on this idea that we have to re-engage big pharma to keep the model intact, right? Why not have the public sector go in and mimic some of the work that, or some of the investments that the big companies do when they acquire companies before the later stages of R&D, that would sort of, why not consider issues like options like a public buyout at a certain point, and then you kind of develop it through the remaining part of clinical development through a non-profit partnership like GARP. You have then full control over how you're going to, or you have more control at least, on how you're going to produce it, how you're planning to do your registration in countries where there is a need instead of where, there is only a high market or a profitable market. All these things, I think these merits a much closer look. And I think that's where Europe can go in and actually explore, now that they're planning to set up a whole new agency. This is a real possibility to do things better. And I think we're all seeing sort of where we have to do things better. It's just about finding the political will to do it.
And Tim, from your perspective, I'm guessing and assuming that the Wellcome Trust is in touch with the European Commission. Are you encouraged by the discussions around HERA when it comes to tackling AMR?
Well, certainly encouraged with the announcement of HERA. And as Helle said, I mean, we don't know enough details about really where it should go. Wellcome is working with the Federation of European Academies of Medicine to provide views and input around here on what we will think. And a report will be forthcoming later in May, I believe, on that. So, no, it's early days for the thinking of HERA, as well as our analysis of the situation. But if we look at HERA as we see it today, I mean, it's certainly a very promising prospect. But it needs to be on a very significant scale if it is to address the public health needs. Now, it is at one level, it's a form of a procurement mechanism for making sure that necessary medical countermeasures and medical products are available in the European Union. Well, I completely agree philosophically with Helle's point about making sure that antibiotics are available in countries around the world for what they need. I'm not sure that the HERA is going to be the right instrument to try and achieve those goals. But the benefit of a HERA is that it can overcome that first problem that I mentioned before when I talked about 3As, and that's about making sure that there's first the availability of these products. The fact is, if no one actually develops these products and gets them approved and demonstrates that they are safe and effective in treating infections, the rest of it's an academic debate. So HERA can be an effective mechanism of bringing forward products and demonstrating that they're useful and safe for people to use. I'm not sure I would overburden it to do everything. But the broader perspective is a very important one. Helle is exactly right in saying that the European Commission needs to have that end-to-end view. So how does HERA fit into that broader picture? Providing continued and ideally increasing support for basic sciences in this space will remain important, but there is an area in terms of translation that is not strong enough. And that translation, supporting the translation of the basic science into the early candidate stage and providing sufficient support for particularly those small, medium-sized companies to move forward. Rohit already mentioned it. We do need to see improvements in that space. And again, HERA, I think, while very promising thing, probably would be beyond the appropriate mission of a HERA to solve that element.
Well, it remains, there is a lot of talk around here, but it remains to be seen exactly as you said, how much money is going to be invested, what kind of long-term strategic planning will be there, and what kind of mandate and how independent and proof, not vulnerable to shifting political priorities HERA will be. These are all parameters that remain to be seen. There is a question, which I like, and I think it's a nice way to wrap up. It says, do you still have faith in finding effective antibiotics? So let's conclude with this one. And again, for our viewers, it will be useful to focus exactly on what you would like to see in the coming months and years specifically from the EU, and where do you think that, of course, it's a global discussion, right? And we shouldn't forget the global dimension of this topic. So for your concluding remarks, if I may ask you, so do you have this faith that we can be optimistic that we're going to get to the point of having effective antibiotics? And secondly, what would make you happy to see from the European Union in the coming months and years? There is not so much time left for the mandate of the current commission anyway. Helle, over to you first, sorry.
Okay. Yeah, I'm optimistic. I think it can be done. I think it requires steering with intent. I think that we need governments to go in and put in place the resources and the focus that is needed to make it done. And that includes both obviously financial resources, but it also includes creating the ecosystem where, you know, knowledge can be shared, where transparency is paramount, where, you know, you create a research environment where we can learn from each other's mistakes instead of repeating the same ones, where funding is going into, you know, the priorities that are not just European, but of global priority. I think all of that can certainly be done, but it does require governments to step up and really, you know, take on this task and take the responsibility, and perhaps end this sort of perhaps preferable actions to sort of defer it to different actors to solve it. That's not going to happen. I think we can, you know, look at the last 30 years and just draw that conclusion very clearly. So yeah, I'll probably end there and just call on governments to make the concerted action that is needed in those early stages. Yeah, end there.
Rohit?
Yeah, a couple of things. I mean, I am optimistic. If we look at what's occurred over the last year, and there's been a lot written on just how much scientific energy and resources and have been put towards addressing COVID-19 and what that has generated, really tells us about just the possibilities that exist if we were seeing the same thing with antibiotic resistance. But of course, we are living through a tremendous moral failure for access to these products right now around the world. So I think the real question is, are we going to get the politics right of this? I always find the most dangerous moment is once everyone agrees on where we actually want to get to be on all sides of it, is when all the complications arise, because that's when you start to get people saying the same thing, but really meaning something else. And I guess for the EU, I would end on, I agree with Tim and what you're saying, that the EU cannot sort of be all things to all people. But as you were noting, you know, antibiotic resistance is it's a pandemic of drug-resistant infections. And if we are not paying attention to the priorities and needs of people in other countries, it will come back to the European Union. It is important to not only think about what is important in Europe to build the right resilience in Europe, but to really think how we build the right resilience and solutions globally. And that will mean that for entities like HERA, to really not just look at what seems to be of the most important, of the most import in the EU at present.
Well, on the bright side, it's thanks, or in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, it's the first time, at least, that I see governments in Europe really thinking along the lines of R&D. I think it's really squarely on their radar, and I think it's a first. I don't know where it's going to go, but it's really, it got the COVID-19 situation, got governments to think in terms of R&D. Tim, over to you for some concluding remarks. And you know, this is a space obviously dominated by actors like React. Make sure that you read the report and obviously keep an eye on everything that Wellcome Trust is doing. So Tim, over to you. Are you optimistic?
Yes, I am optimistic, but it is a cautious optimism. We are a critical moment in time. You know, if I focus more narrowly on antimicrobial resistance as an issue, we've had some progress in the space. We've had some engagement. We're hearing lots of nice talk, but frankly, we do not have sufficient momentum, engagement, or political will behind this as an issue. It is something that is urgent, but it remains something that's creeping up silently on us. So we must see more commitment to addressing this issue. And of course, it is a global issue. It's one that needs to be framed in terms of the global needs, and then the local programs for interventions can be deployed through that perspective. COVID-19 has told us a lot of very good things and also some very concerning things. It has demonstrated the value of investing in research and the value of high quality R&D capabilities to be able to pivot and deliver needs in a crisis. We need to see further investment and support in this space. And that's something that European Union, I'm sure appreciates, but still, I want to make sure that the thinking is looking at the long-term perspective as well as thinking about those things that need to be able to move in a rapid response mode. The global health architecture is very likely to change in the wake of COVID-19 pandemic. AMR needs to be considered in that new architecture. And the approaches that the European Union should take in this, they need to consider how the European Union fits in that global health architecture. So for antibiotic development and R&D, what I want to see is further investment supporting the basic research, new forms of investment that support translation and small and medium-sized enterprises in this space. And there have to be some ways of considering how do we have new interventions and new ways of paying for these drugs to get them into healthcare systems.
Fantastic. This was the best way to conclude. And thank you for this call for action. For surely and undoubtedly for us at EPHA, we are here to support your work. So this is just the beginning. I'm sure that this is a discussion that we will have again. Obviously, when we have more information about what the Commission is planning when it comes to HERA. So thank you very much, Helle Agard from the REACT Group, Rohit Malpani, and Tim Jinks from the Wellcome Trust. Thank you for your time. Thank you to everyone who joined us. The next episode, the 8th episode of the Access to Medicines Dialogues, will be on May 18th, and it will be an interview with Clemens Auer on everything that went down between pharma and the EU during the COVID-19 vaccine negotiations. So that's something which is going to be fun, I promise. Thank you so much for your time. We are in touch. This is only the beginning of the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Nice.